by a guest who's been on the show a couple times, Charles Coulombe. He's a historian who specializes in all sorts of history, especially Habsburg history, and he's written a book on Charles of Austria. And this summer he happened to be up in my neck of the woods, and he signed his book. Charles, you want to tell us a bit about, take a couple minutes, tell us about your trip to Canada?
Well, sure. Basically, we have mutual friends, Alan Goudman and his wife, and they invited me up for a tour of their province. Alan's actually an Englishman, but he's lived in Alberta for 20 years. And they took me all over. I arrived in Calgary. I went to the Ordinariate Mass in Calgary, and then we set off for places I'd always wanted to see. I was at Jasper 10 years ago, and that Jasper and the lodge there, and going through on the Canadian, that was the totality of my Alberta experience prior to last summer. So we went to Banff. We went to Chateau Lake Louise. We went down to Waterton and uh,
The Prince of
Prince of
Wales Hotel.
Wales. Yeah, the Prince of Wales Hotel, and we saw the northernmost American Ranger Station in Glacier National Park. Before I'd been on Highway to the Sun and all that, but that it just came to the very tip. We went to Hellier. We saw the Dinosaur Museum. We saw Buffalo Jump. We saw one of the Mountie museums, which was quite something. We went to Vulcan. I sat in Captain Kirk's own chair. So I was, all of you Trekkies out there, you go to Vulcan. We did not go to St. Paul and the UFO landing pad, much as we wanted to. I wanted to go to St. Paul and St. Albert, Lac La Biche, but we all got sick, so we had to cut the trip short, sadly. But the climax of it was in Edmonton.
That's my hometown, by the way.
I'm sorry, your hometown?
Yeah, my hometown.
Ah, I also went to Aberdare and saw the world's largest kolbasa, which is the great claim to fame, and the Basilian Monasteries Museum and gift shop. So I mean, it was a real grab bag of Albertiana. I found out that the Tim Hortons coffee is really bad. I mean,
Like,
really bad.
yeah, I could have told you that. Yeah.
Well, but an explanation. There's a Canadian family living here at the ITI in Trumau, and they told me that what had happened was that Tim Horton had traded the Tim Hortons chain for whatever reason, traded their recipe with McDonald's, their coffee recipe. So if you want to get the original taste of Tim Hortons, apparently you have to go to McDonald's.
That's true. That is what happened. Yeah.
I didn't know that. So the next time I'm up there, but I usually put up my nose at going to McDonald's, but after this little revelation, I will go to Mickey D for the original Tim Hortons coffee. What I might do is get a cup of Tim Hortons coffee, empty it, go across to Mickey D, buy a cup of coffee, pour it into the Tim Hortons cup, and pretend that I'm having an original Tim Hortons experience.
Oh, okay. Well, I hate to disappoint you. Prior to the swap, it wasn't super great either. It was better, but not super great. I think you'd be completely equal going to a gas station and getting some Circle K coffee. But
so childhood dream is ruined. All right,
yeah,
that's fine.
sorry. Hate to be anticlimactical, but so we're here to talk about the 30 Years' War. So yeah, so you have about an hour, you said?
Hour and a half I can do.
Okay. So you go at your own pace. Yeah, tell us how the 30 Years' War happened, what happened, how it ended, who are the key people. Take it away.
Well, all right. Well, it's kind of a complex story. The important thing to bear in mind is that when you say the Holy Roman Empire, which is where most of it was fought in Europe, you're talking about an entity that's very hard to describe. Um, you might say that in the Middle Ages, all of the European kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire itself, Germany and northern Italy, uh, England, Scotland, France, Spain, or the Spain's, Aragon, Castile, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Naples, uh, Hungary, and the rest, they were all considered to belong to part of a larger entity, the empire. But you've got to bear in mind that in the Middle Ages, everyone was united by the same religion. And just as the church, unites all Catholics in fairly light bonds, they're not something we think about all the time. Well, it was the same was true with being a subject of the empire. Theodosius the Great, back in 380, had made baptism entrance into Roman citizenship. And the barbarian kingdoms that grew up on Roman soil all considered themselves part of the empire, as did kingdoms like Poland, Norway, etc., that were outside. Why is this background important? Well, it's important because it shaped the medieval mind, it shaped the Renaissance mind, and it was the 30 Years' War that would end up destroying it.
Hmm.
So, to really understand the significance of the 30 Years' War, you have to understand what it would destroy. Now, so that's why I'm going to give you this ancient history. Well, 476 AD, the last emperor in the West, in unbroken succession, is deposed. His crown is sent to Constantinople, and they say, okay, we've only got the one emperor again in Constantinople. Bit of time goes by, the 600s, the Muslims arise, they keep the Byzantines busy in the Near East, and so they can't look after the Holy See. So the Holy See, being attacked constantly by people called the Lombards, successive popes begin looking for a new protector. They settle on the Franks, the people running what is now France and Western Germany. These are the Franks. They become such an important factor to the popes that in the year 800, on Christmas Day, the Pope crowned Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, as the renewed emperor in the West. And that's an extremely important date. And it's an extremely important thing to understand for our story. Why? Because Charlemagne would be considered at once the first Holy Roman Emperor and the first King of France. Later on, they sort of made up arms for him, and those arms were half the double eagle of the empire and half the gold and blue lilies on the blue field of France. So, why is that important? Because when he died, of course, his grandsons, eventually, his son held on to things, but his grandsons fought each other and basically created what would become the kingdoms of France, Germany, and northern Italy. They divided the inheritance of Charlemagne. But from that time down to modern times, the rivalry between what you might call the successors of Charlemagne, France, and the Holy Empire, even though France was considered to be part of the Holy Empire, that rivalry, in a lot of ways, determined the course of European history, and it would determine the course of the 30 Years' War. So, fast forward, you've got a lot of medieval history where by the 1400s, where other European kingdoms are becoming more centralized. Because in the Middle Ages, of course, things were very decentralized. The kings didn't have a lot of power. They had authority, but they didn't have a lot of power, and nothing really like the modern state. But in the 1400s, you begin to see that develop. And these different countries in Europe slowly centralize and become more and more along the lines of what we know today. The opposite, however, is going to happen in Central Europe. Well, in 1517, you have a very, very important imperial election. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor, unlike the Kingdom of France, which is hereditary, the Holy Roman Emperors are elected at this point. And they are elected by 7 electors, 3 of whom are Catholic archbishops, and 4 of whom are lay princes of the empire. The Count Palatine, the Elector of Saxony, the Elector of Brandenburg, the King of Bohemia, and the boy, we're missing someone in there. I can't think of him. Well, he'll come to me. Anyway, the King of Bohemia.
Is it someone in the Rhineland, Hanover?
That's the Count Palatine. Hanover comes later. The oddly enough, the Elector of Hanover would be a later creation.
Okay.
But you had 3 ecclesiastical and 4 secular electors. They would elect the in the High Middle Ages. They would elect the Emperor King at Frankfurt. He would be crowned King of the Romans / King of Germany at Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, the old capital of Charlemagne. Then he'd go down south and be crowned King of Italy. And that Kingdom of Italy was just northern Italy, either in Pavia or Milan. Then he'd go to Rome and be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. Well, that was the way it had been for time out of mind. So the election of 1517 comes along. You have 3 major candidates for emperor. One is the grandson of the last emperor and King of Spain in his own right, because his family had intermarried backwards and forwards, and that was Charles of the House of Habsburg, Charles I of Spain. The second was Francis I of France, and the third was Henry VIII of England. Now, why is it important to remember that they were part of this election? Because it speaks to the fact that beyond the Holy Roman Empire as the Central European entity, there was the idea that it was also, at the same time, this larger formation that included everybody. And that was why the King of France and the King of England could run for the office. Anyway, Charles wins, and having won, he's King of Spain, he's Holy Roman Emperor. In his Spanish colonies are expanding into Mexico and Peru. And it would be said of him that he was the first man upon whose empire the sun never set. Unfortunately for the united Christendom he was working for, the Protestant revolt broke out. Now, he had 2 other enemies. The French, seeing Habsburgs in Spain, on their south to the east, they felt surrounded. And from that time on, definitely, there'd always been rivalry. But from that time on, the French resolved to try to break Habsburg dominance because they felt encircled. The third element, Protestants, French, now the third is Turks. Because the Ottomans would take advantage of Charles V's weakness when he was struggling with the French, with the Protestants here or there. They would then attack. They'd already taken over most of Hungary. No, I'm sorry, they would do that later in 1526, but they were pressuring.
That's the Battle of Mohawk?
Mohacs, yeah.
Yeah.
And when that would come, most of Hungary would fall to them. But at any rate, they were angling for control. And then, of course, later on, their navies went all over the Mediterranean, and that would keep going until the Battle of Lepanto. So you had a clear and present danger to the unity of the empire and to the freedom of Europe in these three factions. Well, eventually, Charles V gives up. He's tired, he's old, And in 1545, I think he abdicates. But he says, this is too much for one man to handle. So he gives Spain and his colonies there to his son Philip II, who will then inherit the throne of Portugal on top of it, the Portuguese Empire, which was also worldwide. And the empire and the hereditary Habsburg lands will go to his brother. So now you have two branches of the House of Habsburg, Spanish and Austrian. Well, in 1555, after several wars, when a number of Protestant princes in Germany after 1520 had established different leagues.
Schmokelduk?
Schmalkaldic was one of them. There was the League, I think, of Dessau before that. No, the League of Dessau was Catholic, I think. Anyway, doesn't matter. There were successive Protestant leagues and successive Catholic leagues against each other within the empire. Now, this, of course, really began to disrupt the already kind of vestigial governing apparatus of the empire. You have the Diet, you have the High Court, you have various provincial authorities. But more and more, due to the religious dissension, these become very, very difficult to operate. So, what happens? Well, in 1555, they have what's called the Peace of Augsburg. And the Peace of Augsburg basically delineates the Catholic and Protestant territories, Lutheran territories. Meanwhile, more is going on. Switzerland is becoming more and more independent for the Habsburgs. And the northern Netherlands have turned Calvinist and are struggling for independence from Spain in what is called the 80 Years' War.
So the northern part, is that Frisia?
Well, Frisia is part of it, but also Holland, Utrecht, Drenthe, Overijssel, Gelderland, all that, what is now the Netherlands, as opposed to the Spanish Netherlands, which remain Belgium and Luxembourg. So there's continual fighting going on there, but then as the Spanish Empire, and then added to it the Portuguese Empire, as it expands overseas and their shipping becomes a big deal, the Dutch begin going after their fleets and eventually their colonies. And that's how eventually the Dutch get established in the East Indies. And that's why they go to places like the Cape of Good Hope.
Is that where Suriname comes from too, or?
Yeah, well, so that was a bit later that they moved west, but it was the same impulse. It was during this period that the Dutch become an overseas empire, and they seize as much as they can from the Spanish and Portuguese. So they take Ceylon from the Portuguese, south of India, Sri Lanka. They take Celebes, northern Celebes, and the Spanish. They take Amboina and the Spice Islands and Flores and all that for the Portuguese in the East Indies. They take Malacca in Malaysia from the Portuguese. And so it goes. And wherever they go, they do their best to stomp out the Catholic Church because they're Calvinists. Now, Calvinism then begins to spread in Germany. And this is problematic because the Peace of Augsburg only allows for Catholics and Lutherans.
It didn't allow for the Utrechists?
Well, no, the Utrechists were part of the whole Hussite thing, and they were basically a dead issue by the time of the Protestant Revolt. They still existed, but there weren't many of them, and they were kind of hiding out. Okay. But they wouldn't become a big deal again until the 18th century, when they ended up sending missionaries all over the place. That's the whole other story. And they played a part in the foundation of Methodism, but that's the 18th century, so we don't have to worry about that. Anyhow, so what happens then is that uh, the more and more Catholic territories are seized by either Lutherans or Calvinist princes uh, in the course of the
By
next 70
territories, by territories, do you mean in Europe or the colonies?
in Europe. So you've got these two parallel tracks going on. You've got the tensions within Central Europe, within the Holy Roman Empire, but then you've also got the war between the Spanish and Portuguese on the one hand and the Dutch on the other on the high seas. So these two conflicts, as the 16th century ends, the 17th century begins, they begin to get hotter and hotter. Well, in the meantime, the elector of the Palatine, the elector of the Rhine, becomes a Protestant, a Calvinist. In 1617, Emperor Matthias, who's a Habsburg, is the also king of Bohemia. He dies, and he is replaced by his cousin Ferdinand, who will be Ferdinand II. Now he had already made a vow to Our Lady that he would extirpate heresy from any lands that she chose to give him. At this time, Bohemia, the Utraquists, really, as I say, they were long gone, but something of their tradition, I guess, lived on. And a lot of the nobility in Bohemia were Protestant. Nevertheless, they duly elected Ferdinand as King of Bohemia. And as King of Bohemia, he cast his vote for himself, and he became Holy Roman Emperor.
Oh.
Now, this is where the story gets a little complex. The Catholic princes of the empire had formed the Catholic League under Maximilian of Bavaria, who was a cousin of the Elector Palatine, same family, the House of Wittelsbach. The Elector of the Palatine, he in turn had married the sister of Charles I of England. And they had several sons, the most famous of whom was Prince Rupert.
Were they Protestant or because Charles I was technically Protestant, but he had some Catholic leanings. So
these folks were all Protestant.
Okay.
And Prince Rupert and his brothers would end up fighting on the Protestant side during the 30 Years' War.
Okay.
So the Protestants, on the other hand, had formed a Protestant union to oppose the Catholic League. And their leader was, I think, Christian, the Duke of Brunswick. But they remember there are a lot of little states within what we call Germany. They were states of the empire, and they tended to be extremely independent and did what they did when they wanted to do it. Well, long and short of it all, the king of Bohemia, Ferdinand, is faced with a rebellion in 1620 on the part of his 1618, sorry, on the part of the Bohemian Protestant nobility, who say, "Just kidding," and they depose him, and they elect the Elector Palatine as King of Bohemia. Obviously, Ferdinand isn't happy about this. Initially, the Protestants have a lot of success. For a short period, they have him captured. But then his armies rally. They defeat them at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. Frederick and his wife leave the country, and ever after, what's that?
Well, and didn't some guy get thrown out a window or something?
Well, that was the emperor's ambassador to the estates in Prague. They threw him out a window. Okay. That was called the Second Defenestration of Prague. They'd done it once before. So it's kind of a national custom with the Czechs, I guess. Anyway, defenestration. It's not as much fun as you might think. And years and years and years later, Emperor Karl, when he was a student in Prague, would live in the apartment with the window that they threw the guy out of.
Emperor Karl, as in?
as in that one. Yeah.
Wow.
So he thought that was kind of funny.
I don't
But
remember that being in that biography.
I don't remember that I put it in that biography, but
Oh.
I happen to know it.
Second edition. You'll have to add it in.
Oh, you don't know. Anyway, so what should happen is, but that the Protestants are defeated in Bohemia, but the war extends finally to the rest of the country, and the Protestant League and the Protestant Union and the Catholic League go to war. Initially, the Protestants don't do very well, but one of the peculiarities of the imperial constitution was that there were outside rulers who nevertheless were members of the empire by virtue of having territories within the empire. And one of these was the King of Denmark, Christian IV. So in 1620 he intervenes. Initially he's very victorious, but the Catholic side pull themselves together. 1625 he's defeated.
I'm curious. Is he related to the Danish princess who got married to King James?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And she converted to Catholicism, interestingly enough. Anne of Denmark.
Yeah. I'm curious. How were they related?
I don't remember if they were brother and sister, but they might have been. I'd have to check. I don't recall.
Not hard to type into Google, but yeah.
Yeah,
Continue.
easy to type into Google, you know. But in the meantime, so they get defeated. It looks like the Protestants' geese are cooked, but they find another outside supporter, and that is Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, the Lion of the North. So he intervenes. He's at war, actually, with Poland, because the King of Poland is a cousin of his and has a claim to the Swedish throne. So this is all connected. And of course, the Dutch, in the meantime, the Spanish Habsburgs, give a few troops, but especially money, to the Austrian Habsburgs. And the head of the Catholic League is Maximilian of Bavaria, who's the Catholic cousin of the Elector Palatine of the Rhine. Eventually, the Elector Palatine is defeated, his territories are seized, and his electoral vote is given to Maximilian. So from that time until the end of the empire in 1806, it's the Bavarian Wittelsbachs who become electors of the emperor. And the Upper Palatinate, which is the northern part of Bavaria today, that gets added to their dominions. Well, anyhow, so Gustavus Adolphus comes flying south, and he builds up the Protestant side. And this is where it gets a bit strange, because in the late 1620s, Pope Urban VIII is very anti-Habsburg. So he begins to encourage the French to go into the war on the Swedish side.
The Pope was responsible for this?
Yep.
This Pope Urban VIII, this is the same guy who presided over the trial of Galileo, right?
Urban VIII. I'm not sure, so I won't tell you.
Okay.
That could have been Urban VII, I think.
Well, I think that he had two trials, Galileo, but that's off topic. So Pope Urban VIII.
So Pope Urban VIII attempted to. Louis XIII had been against intervening in the war, although his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, was for it. But part of the reason was that the king was having his own problems with the French Protestants at that time, Huguenots, and he was besieging La Rochelle when the Pope said to him that basically invading and attacking the Habsburgs would be just as pleasing to God as taking New Rochelle, La Rochelle. So he, in the end, was responsible for the French joining the Swedes when, after the Battle of Nordlingen in 1629, it looked like things were over for them.
For the Swedes or for the Holy Roman Empire?
For the Swedes.
Oh, okay.
So, meantime, the there are a lot of side points to it. The interesting characters like Wallenstein, who, even though he was Protestant, for a while was one of the emperor's best generals.
I thought he was
And
Catholic.
what's that?
I thought he was Catholic, Wallenstein.
In the end,
Or
but he
oh, okay,
began Protestant.
okay, yeah, because there was him and Tilly, right?
Tilly was the actually the general of the Catholic League, but he commanded the United Armies.
Okay.
And Wallenstein and Tilly were the two big leaders on the Catholic side. But the the interesting thing, and this is a phrase that might sound familiar to some people living today, uh, when he was asked, he being uh, Ferdinand II, when he was asked, what do you think about the Pope siding with the French and the Swedes? He said, I will be the champion of the faith despite the Pope.
Sounds very sedevacantist or something.
I wouldn't say sedevacantist. I mean, one of the things, if you know your papal history, one of the things you soon realize is that papal infallibility doesn't cover politics.
Yeah.
Or to put this another way, 40 years after the end of the war, 41 years, the then Pope will back William of Orange against James II.
Well, that's because he was fighting against the Gallicans in France, right?
Well, it's because he was fighting Louis XIV. But again, infallibility doesn't cover politics.
Yeah.
And he's
I
saying
mean,
he's saying the Te Deum when he got the news of the Battle of the Boyne.
yeah, that in the Glorious Revolution, yeah.
Yeah. So I mention this because it's important to bear in mind that these things are not quite so simple as they seem to us. One of the interesting side benefits of the French alliance with the Turks against the Habsburgs was the position of the Church in the Holy Land,
Oh.
because the Pope was able to get the Turks, as the price of his support, to surrender all sorts of properties to the Franciscans.
Hmm.
It's a lot more complicated than people like things to be. We like everything to be strictly black and white, but they're not. So what should happen? And don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm a complete supporter of the Imperial Party. That's absolutely. But the fact remains, it's an ill wind that blows no one any good, and God does bring good out of evil. So the French were able to use their position in the Near East to secure the safety of the Holy Lands, and it's why the holy places are why the church has a position in them today. At any rate, the and there are all sorts of French governmental possessions, churches, and so on in the Holy Land today that are a remnant of that. At any rate, so by 1630, the war, that stage of the war seems to be over. In 1635, they have the Peace of Prague. Looks like the war is going to end, but then the French get into the war officially, and the war goes on. Now, this war was very different from a lot of the wars that you had had before and after, because traditionally in Europe, warfare was seen as the job of the nobility, of the knights, and of hired mercenaries. And if you didn't belong to one of those groups, you were considered to be kind of out of it. it was considered an atrocity to kill civilians and to burn farms and that sort of thing. That was very much looked down on before the 30 Years' War. But the religious hatreds in the 30 Years' War brought in a popular side to the fighting that had never been there before. And the result was a war that was far bloodier than anything Central Europe had seen since the onset of Catholicism.
Does that include the 100 Years' War?
Yeah, the 100 Years' War was, I mean, one of the atrocities the French were accused of at Agincourt was killing the camp followers of the English. You didn't do that, you see. It wasn't done.
That was was that like during the battle or
During the battle, right?
okay? Yeah, I vaguely remember something like that. Yeah.
So that was considered, a terrible thing. But after the during the 30 Years' War, rather, you might say the whole class consciousness thing disappeared, and it became a popular matter. Now, this was such a horrible result that the war, when it finally did end in 1648, Ferdinand III was the emperor then, the son of Ferdinand II. When the war finally ended, Central Europe was exhausted.
I can imagine.
And until the French Revolution, they would never again have that kind of popular participation in warfare. And then, of course, the French Revolution began the whole idea of the nation in arms and all that, which is what we're used to now. But there was that period where the 30 Years' War had, if anything, reinforced the disgust with that kind of popular fighting that the 30 Years' War had engendered. Anyway, so with the Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, a couple of treaties involved, but several things happened. Firstly, the Protestant churches were confirmed in their existence, and the law to whom belongs the region belongs the religion became the standard. The Spanish recognized the independence of the Netherlands. Portugal had a sort of an illegitimate sign of its last dynasty had become king after fighting a war to do so. Switzerland left the Holy Roman Empire, and it was restricted to more or less Austria, Slovenia, Czechia, and Germany of today, with some other territories. But the internal workings of the empire were even looser than they had been. The Protestant electors and the Protestant princes pretty much ran their own show, and this, of course, would pave the way of entry for the rise of Prussia as a great power in Europe. That was all on the one side. On the other side, the position of the Catholics, wherever they were dominant, was retained. But the diplomatic framework of Europe was established for a very long time at the Peace of Westphalia. And above all, France became the greatest power in Western Europe. And as a result, this would be the beginning of a series of world wars, which were nothing like as horrible as the 30 Years' War, but they weren't fun. And they were fought in Europe and America and the high seas. The first being the War of the Grand Alliance in 1689, which saw Louis XIII basically pitted against Louis XIV, pitted against most of Europe, including the Holy See. Hence the Te Deum at the Battle of the Boyne. You then have the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1713, which in America was called Queen Anne's War. The War of Austrian Succession, when the main line of the Habsburgs failed. That was in the 1740s. We called it King George's War in America. And then the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in America. And these were all world wars fought in the Age of Sail. And in a sense, the 30 Years' War both set up the premise for them on the one hand, but also took the popular element out of them, so that these wars would go back to being the business of the ruling classes and whoever they could hire. So I suppose you would say that was a development. The third item that came out of all of this was, believe it or not, the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Yes, because people being so murderous in the name of the same God they all claim to believe in was considered kind of scandalous by a lot of people. And the temptation to say, well, they're all so barbarous, how could their God be true? And so from that came deism.
And then eventually agnosticism, then atheism.
All that.
Yeah.
All that.
Wow. I bet Christopher Hitchens would be happy hearing that if he was alive today.
Well, indeed. And of course, the same thing was happening. You pointed out quite rightly that the wars of the Three Kingdoms in Britain paralleled the last decade or so of the 30 Years' War. And it's interesting that Frederick the Winter King's sons fought for their uncle, King Charles. So when in 1652 that smoke had cleared, you had Oliver Cromwell and his Puritans firmly in charge of England, Scotland, Ireland, and their American colonies. In Europe, in continental Europe, you had, as I say, the stage was set for Louis XIV's ascendancy. So that, had it worked differently, it would have been the end of Protestantism in Europe.
Well,
but it didn't.
Oh, okay.
But it didn't. So the rights of the Protestants, both Calvinist and Lutheran, were guaranteed in those countries, those lands that took them.
In the Westphalia Treaty, right?
Right. With Switzerland, oddly enough, because they were divided into Catholic and Calvinist cantons, it would set the stage for 2 or 3 civil wars later on.
Oh, not good.
The last of which, the Sonderbund War, was as late as 1847.
Wow. And it was purely based on religion, or was there politics involved?
Well, there were politics in the sense that there had been a kind of Catholic, Catholic friendly government in the canton called Aargau. It was replaced by not a Protestant but a liberal government, which abolished all the monasteries. That caused the Catholic cantons to form a union called the Sonderbund for self-protection. And that in turn led to a war between them and the Protestant cantons, which they lost. And that was the last Swiss civil war over religion. But it's interesting that it was in the 19th century.
Yeah, no, it's hard to think that was happening 170 years ago. So you talked about Ferdinand III. That's son of Ferdinand II, right? Did he inherit by hereditary, or was he elected by the electors?
He was elected. Every emperor was elected down to the last of them, Franz II, the first of Austria,
And
in
sorry.
in 1795, I think.
Okay, because I mean, was this always the case with the Holy Roman Empire? Because I've been studying the investiture controversy, um, and I believe the electors would only choose if there was a new dynasty, like
Yeah,
the Etonian dynasty went extinct.
right.
Then they had to elect. I think it was Conrad II, who is the father of Henry III, then of course the infamous son of the devil, Henry IV.
The Salian
Yeah, so
was, and then after them, the Hohenstaufens. And then after the Hohenstaufens, you had a period they call the interregnum in the 1200s when several different totally ineffective emperors were elected. Alfonso of Spain, Richard of Cornwall, who had no territorial base in Central Europe and couldn't really affect anything. And then finally, I think it was 1274, but I could be wrong on the date, Rudolph of Habsburg was elected the first Habsburg Roman emperor. And then after him, there'd be several Habsburgs, several Luxembourgs, several Wittelsbachs, until Frederick III in 1440, was it? Whatever it was mid 1400s. With his election from that time, with one 18th century exemption for 3 years, every emperor was a Habsburg.
And when did they start electing everyone?
In the
Because I
wake
don't.
of the death, in the wake of the death of the last Hohenstaufen, and
Okay.
Frederick II died.
Yeah, because it seemed like in the case when the Etonian dynasty died out, they only elected if a dynasty had died out.
Right.
That's how. What dynasty was Conrad II, Henry III, fourth, and fifth part of?
The Salians.
Aliens. Okay. Yeah, I've just been reading some primary source. I actually read the primary source chronicle from the 12th century of Henry IV's life. And boy, that guy at the end of his life had no friends left. All his sons had turned on him, and oh man, it was a
It was pretty sad, I must say. And
yeah.
you know the best book on the empire in English, if you really want to get a grasp for it, is oddly enough still the oldest, and that's Viscount Bryce's book. Looks like Viscount Bryce, Bryce, Viscount Bryce's book entitled "The Holy Roman Empire."
And what's the best book on the 30 Years' War?
That's a good question. Well, oddly enough, from the standpoint of Habsburgs, I would recommend a book called For God and Kaiser, which is actually a history of the Imperial Army. But the Imperial Army, as we know it, started around the 30 Years' War.
Oh, sorry.
For God and Kaiser.
For God and Kaiser. All right. And yeah, because I remember when we were chatting, I asked you about this book I have, The 30 Years' War by Friedrich Schiller. You said that's more of like a literary work than a meaningful history, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I've not read this book yet. I do mean to eventually, but Forgotten Kaiser. Want to take a couple questions?
Sure.
All right. This is from my friend City of the Immaculata. We've collabed together. What is Charles' opinion of 30 years being a war of religion versus war of emerging nation states? Historians will argue both. Can you even make these a lot to chew on there.
That's a beautiful question, really. And the Can you even make those distinctions? I would argue no. I would argue that, you know, these things, one of the problems with the whole idea of separation of church and state is that it doesn't exist in reality. Every
Well, like,
society, every society,
yeah, sorry.
every society has an animating principle, an animating philosophy that occupies the place of a state church. So, regardless of what it might be, I mean, my church might be separate from the state, but the state is animated by something.
Yep.
Now, it was a war of religion in one sense, absolutely, but it was also part of the process of the emerging nation states, as the Protestant revolt itself was. Because it isn't, when we say nation state, remember, we're not just talking about the emergence of nationality, which was a vague concept. I mean, it existed, but it was vague. We're also talking about the emergence of the modern state apparatus. And that was definitely a part of what was going on. As mutatis mutandis was going on in the Protestant revolt earlier on, you could say that the civil wars that Europe had in the 12, 13, and 1400s, things like the War of the Roses, the Armagnacs and Burgundians, in France, the Guelphs and Ghibellines, even a lot of the Hundred Years' War, actually. All of these civil wars were, despite their proximate causes, contributed to the emergence of the modern state. Because the victor in each case wanted to do his best to destroy what was left of his opponents. And the problem was that in the medieval state, you didn't really have the machinery to do that. So the machinery had to be created. A beautiful example is Henry VII creating the Court of Star Chamber. You did the state did not have the means to dominate its citizens the way our state does, but this was the beginning of it. This was how it got on that way. And mind you, this all happens for obvious reasons. You come to the throne after a difficult period of fighting. You want to make sure this never happens again. What do? Well, you strengthen your hand. The thing about the medieval monarchy was that it had a great deal of authority, but very little power. And just so our viewers know the difference, power is the ability to make things happen. Authority is the right to say how that power should be used. And legitimacy is authority from a proper source. If authority is not legitimate, people will tend to ignore it, and power will do what power does. So in the Middle Ages, power was extremely diffuse. The church had some, the king had some, the nobles had some, the cities had some, even the serfs had some. It was all divided. But the king, using his legitimacy coming from the church and God, he exercised his authority to try to bring these peoples together. So if you had a good king, he was like an orchestra leader. But if you had a bad king, you didn't really get despotism, although he could make life unpleasant for the people around him. You got anarchy. And so, in response to that, that eventually led, as I say, to a series of these civil wars in the 13, 1400s. Eventually, the modern state began to emerge as a way of trying to ensure that didn't happen again. And then, because several other things, what's that?
Well, so much for that, right?
Well, no. Several other things are happening at the same time, though. The emergence of a money economy, uh, the the change in philosophy from a Platonic to an Aristotelian one. All of these had a certain amount of influence, and then of course the Renaissance. All of these things had an influence on the course of history, um, pushing us in the direction that we finally came. And the 30 Years' War was an important milestone on that way because people in Germany really began thinking in a hard way, how do we establish order so this doesn't happen again? Part of it is by becoming somewhat irreligious, a state that functions for the common good without issues of religion. This idea began to arise. And of course, it became the dominant motif of the modern state.
Hmm.
You had
And this is where we
these
get the fake separation of church and state, which you said is a farce.
eventually. Well,
But-
it's a farce in the sense that it's possible not to have an established official church. That's possible. What is not possible is to have a government that isn't animated by something, some
well, yeah.
philosophy. I mean, it's like saying, you know what, I'm going to go through life without a set of personal ethics. Well, even if you say that, you've suddenly declared one.
Yeah.
You can't actually do it. You will always have a sense of right and wrong. Now, your sense of right and wrong and mine might be diametrically opposed. But what you can't say is that I'm going to go through life without that. Even if you tried to, you've already set boundaries. You've already made a right and wrong. What's right is whatever benefits me. That's right. And anything that doesn't benefit me is wrong. Now, I don't think that's a very good ethical standard, but it is an ethical standard. I will never be able to escape having to have one. Well, it's the same with this sort of animating philosophy for societies and states. Now, the thing about the Enlightenment also, and the growth of the modern state through the 18th century, you had the emergence of the royals they called the enlightened monarchs. The so-called absolutist monarchs, I have to say so-called because none of them were as absolute as the governments we live under today. So it's kind of a
Yeah.
misnomer. But
Yeah, that's true.
they, again, in order to ensure stability and the common good, they strengthened the state. The enlightened despots, people like Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, Joseph II, to a degree Louis XV, they introduced the ideas of the Enlightenment into administration. And then the day came when the modern state realized, in some sense, it didn't need the kings that had called it into existence. And that was one of the contributing factors to the age of revolution.
Like
We don't need
1848 and
well, it was 1789, 1776. Uh, we don't
or
need no king no
Cromwell
more.
and
Or
or
Cromwell.
Cromwell and Charles, right?
Yeah, or Cromwell, or I mean, and there's a beautiful example because there Henry VIII creates this oligarchy by the distribution of monastic lands. That oligarchy, a lot of them turned Puritan. It's no surprise that Oliver Cromwell was the great nephew of Thomas Cromwell, who had been Henry VIII's major uh,
Sidekick.
major
For a while
instrument
anyway.
for a while until he got sick of him. He didn't really want to work with Henry for too long, but he stuck with him through the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, what happens then is you've got this wealthy class committed to its own self, and within a very short time, they become more powerful than the king. And that is the real story of the War of the Three Kingdoms, was the monarch versus the oligarchy. and he lost. The restoration it came about simply because the oligarchy had made itself or the Puritan aspect of it made itself so obnoxious to everybody. They had to do it. But the
It became a
restored
victim
monarchy,
of its own success.
precisely. But the restored monarchy under Charles II, well, the king realized that he had to pretend to be as supreme as his father had been, while dealing with the oligarchy, which was a reality that wasn't going away. He was adept at it. His brother James was not. Could anyone decent have made a long-term deal with said oligarchy? That's a whole other kettle of wax.
Well, and of course James was Catholic, which didn't help the case.
It didn't.
Too, right?
They were able to tolerate that as long as it looked like it was a Protestant succession. But when he had a Catholic son born, that was what touched off the so-called Glorious Revolution.
Yeah, and then they got his daughter, who was married to William of Orange, to take control. So, because Parliament did that, right? But
Parliament
Parliament
did
told,
that. Yeah,
yeah, but they told him, it's like, all right, you're going to be king, but Parliament is going to have all the power, right?
precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. And he agreed to it. And obviously, his father-in-law's supporters continued to support him, and they were the Jacobites of song and story. But in the end, of course, as we know, they didn't win. The end of them was at Culloden.
Charles
But at any
III,
rate,
right?
that's a whole other tale. Suffice to say that the 30 Years' War was an important milestone on the way to both to the creation of the nation state and the creation of the atheist state.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, I think that has a bit to do. There's this book a friend at church recommended to me. It's called "Why Liberalism Failed" or something.
Yeah.
And apparently it was endorsed, ironically, by Barack Obama of all people. Yeah, ironic, but no, it says people don't feel like a duty to their state anymore. There's no higher calling. You're just a cog in a machine. Essentially, I've not read the book myself, but I plan on reading it.
That's it's true. I mean, the thing is that at the end of the day, without the altar, without the throne, you won't have anything to hang subsidiarity and solidarity on.
Yeah, that's true.
So you'll end up with a Leviathan state before which we're all tools. Economic units to be milked, and beyond that, useless, which is one reason why euthanasia is becoming such a big deal, because when we become useless to our masters, obviously we've got to be removed. It's like culling herds of cattle, or getting rid of a queen bee that isn't laying eggs anymore. When you stop producing on the farm, it's time to become a steak.
Yeah, no, that's like it kind of it's like we're robots almost. There's no no earthly king, there's no king, and they want us to believe there's no heavenly king. There's no Jesus Christ. There's no Holy Trinity up there that's king over us, right?
Yeah.
So
what happens? If you remember that Hideous Strength, which is a wonderful book by C.S. Lewis, the third volume of his space trilogy, the it's a wonderful, Lewis called it a fairy tale for grown-ups, and that's pretty much what it is. But it shows very strongly how the modern technological state, despite its best efforts, cannot and does not replace the spiritual realities under which we live. There is still God above whom we must serve, or the devil whom we will serve if we won't serve the heavenly King. And that's true whatever our role in life, whether we're, postmen or presidents. And it's always been the case. See, the funny thing is, with all of this change that we've been talking about, all of the alterations in life, the essential realities remain the same. Heaven, hell, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. These remain untouched. You might as well be annoyed at them like being annoyed at the stars in the sky because they won't do what you tell them. But this is something that we how to put it, something we have to teach our children. It's something that our masters can never alter. No matter how many of us they get to say it's so. If you were able to get every human being living in the world today to say that there is no God, they'd still be wrong.
Yeah, that wouldn't change the reality, right? God
No.
above us. Yeah.
It wouldn't. It reminds me of a cartoon that showed this woman stepping out of a skyscraper window, and she's got a balloon in her head. It says, "Gravity, a social construct." And you realize she's about to fall to her death. So I think in looking at the 30 Years' War, we do see a lot of our present being formed. And if you're in the English-speaking world, that's even truer of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms.
Well, of course, I'm Canadian, right? I live in under the Parliament, which seems to be getting worse and worse all the time. And yeah, we do have a monarchy, but it's more or less a fake monarchy with no power.
Well, I mean, again, the majority of people believe that's part of democracy. There was I forget if it's Naseby or Marston Moor, but one of those major battles, 1645, had they're having the tricentennial this year or something. Well, not the tricentennial, but whatever it is, they're having a big anniversary for it. And we'll say it's Marston Moor, but I'm not sure. It could be Naseby, it could be another. We'll say Marston Moor. The tagline on the website is Marston Moor, where modern democracy began. Now, see, as long as you still have the majority of English speakers thinking that that's true, thinking that the monarchy that you have in Britain, Canada, Australia, and all that was established through the growth of freedom and democracy, well, then you can't very well blame it for being powerless, can
you? Yeah, that's true.
If tomorrow, bearing in mind and setting aside for the moment that the current king owes his position to accepting the settlement of 1689. So if he were to go against it, he might as well abdicate, because it would be like an abdication. If you're occupying a house illegally and then you rip up the deed, guess what? It goes back to its owner. This is the problem the king would have doing what I'm about to say. But throw that aside. Forget that. Let's pretend that tomorrow His Majesty said, as King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and my other realms and territories, I hereby ban the practice of abortion. No longer will my unborn subjects be murdered. Infanticide ends from this day forward. Can you imagine the outcry of this dictatorship, this tyranny?
Well, of course, I would say this is based.
Well, so would I, but that's, I hate to say this, we're not the majority.
Yeah,
And
very true.
the king would be out of Buckingham Palace quicker than a wink if he escaped with his life. So, and you might say, and some people know, well, he should do it anyway. Yeah, okay. Who of us is willing to exercise that level of heroism in our own lives? Ha 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 ha. It's
Well,
easy to demand it of other people. But for instance, in my case, I know in Canada and in Britain, none of your money that you pay into taxes goes into abortion. I know that, of course. But in the United States, it does. Now, if I were a hero, I'd
in
stop paying my
Canada, it
income
does.
tax. I was being a bit facetious, I have to admit.
Oh,
It
okay.
does everywhere.
Sorry.
You'll have to excuse me. I get facetious, but it's both a family trait and a personal habit. But if I were a real hero, I'd refuse to pay my income tax on that basis. Or if I were a hero, I'd join Operation Rescue. I dare not demand of the king what I won't do myself.
But okay, I got a hypothetical counter argument. What about? I mean, if we were living in England when they still had the absolute monarchy, like, what about when the monarchy was heavily persecuting Catholics under Queen Elizabeth and even after that?
Well, then it's a little bit the way it is now. Under Queen Elizabeth, of course, you had alternatives. Queen Mary, Queen of Scots. You had the rising in the north. You had rebellions, Catholic rebellions. And in truth, the church and the crown did not really reconcile until Charles I time. Although his mother was a Catholic convert, that self-same Anne of Denmark. But when he first tried to marry a Spanish princess, from that time on, he began negotiating with Rome for reunion. So suddenly we're in a different ballpark. And then what happens? Well, so things go. You've got the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, where Catholics fight alongside high Tories for the king. We're defeated, of course. The Confederation of Kilkenny in Ireland, the Catholic Scots under Montrose were all defeated. Everybody gets smacked around. Cromwell's in charge. Charles II comes back. All right? Charles II is pro-Catholic. Then his brother converts. A lot of Catholic lands are restored. I mean, the Catholics have lost them, not the abbeys, obviously. Then,
Well,
what should happen? Charles II comes to the church on his deathbed. His brother becomes king. Then you've got he's deposed in 1689. You have the Jacobite Wars. 1745, Culloden, the end of the Jacobite Wars. And then something very strange happens. In 1760, George III becomes king. Now, his father, grandfather and great-grandfather had gone along with all the anti-Catholic stuff. But George III was interested in Catholic emancipation. He was the first English king since James to visit Catholic nobility. And then in 1766, King James III, James II's son, dies, and the Pope recognizes George III as king. Then, in 1774, George III puts through the Quebec Act, in which he establishes Catholicism as the religion of the French Canadians in Quebec. This helps precipitate the revolution in the South. The Catholic Scots in the north are driven out of the Catholic Scots in the north are driven out of in New York are driven to Canada. Their parish priest, Father John McKenna, becomes the first Catholic chaplain in the British Army since 1688. Then
Wow.
of course, they have to go to Canada, up to Maxville, Ontario, after the war. And so, from that time on, as far as 1778, George III pushes through the first Catholic Emancipation Act. Unfortunately, France enters the war against him. He feels betrayed
And
by his Catholic brother monarch, loses all interest in
okay.
Catholic emancipation. The
That's too
revolution
bad.
bankrupts France, opens the way for the French Revolution, and a whole other series of problems. George III dies. His son, George IV, a weirdly pro-Jacobite, is the one who he and George III had supported their cousin Henry and Cardinal York financially after he
Well,
lost all his property.
I think at this time the Jacobite line was extinct, right?
In 1807, the last heir
Okay.
was Cardinal York, as I say, and he lost all of his property in the French Revolution. George III and then George IV gave him a pension, so he
Hmm.
managed until he died. So from that time, uh, George IV married a Catholic, Mrs. Fitzherbert. She was a widow. And there's kind of a funny story about that because he was convinced to set her aside. He married this German princess who hated him. That marriage didn't last. When he was dying, Mrs. Fitzherbert, who had never taken another husband because she, as far as our law goes, she was still married to the king. She sent him a locket and a note forgiving him and telling him how much she loved him. He dies. His brother, William IV, becomes king. He calls her into the presence and says, he didn't write you back, but he died saying he loved you. I'd like you to accept a title and become part of the royal family. Mrs. Fitzherbert says, well, I'll tell you what, I won't take the title. I've been Mrs. Fitzherbert since I was married. I've never done anything to disgrace it. But I don't mind joining the family. And so from then until she died, Mrs. Fitzherbert was a regular member of the royal family. That's something you don't hear very often.
No, I'll have to look into that. That's
Well,
interesting.
see,
No.
this is the stuff people don't talk about. Uh, they've talked about the persecutions under Elizabeth. They don't talk about the fact that the British Empire made it possible for the OMIs to evangelize northwestern Canada, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, the Marian Hill missionaries to work in South Africa, and the Benedictines of New Norcia to evangelize the Australian outback, the Marists
Well,
in New Zealand.
my priest, a few years, an old priest of mine, a fraternity of St. Peter priest, he told me that St. John Vianney, who was French, obviously, but he said that England would one day be Catholic again.
Oh,
And I, if you take a look at the stats, the younger generation of England, there's more Catholics than Anglicans.
that's true. That's true. And the trick, however, the great irony with England is that you've got the desiccated remnants of a Catholic order that it's meaningless in one way, but you see, all of the Catholic countries have lost their Catholic order through revolution. There's a great irony at work here. The Protestant mind, and you see it in the English-speaking world, you see it in Scandinavia, northern Germany, and so on. They're able to compromise. They can say wonderful things that are meaningless. They can maintain all sorts of Catholic bits and pieces. Well,
Yeah.
I'll give you a great example, to my mind. Uh, I mean, this this is a perfect example of what I mean. The House of Lords recite this prayer every day that they're in session, and it's an amazing prayer because It sums up all of Catholic social teaching. It's amazing. Uh, it. I mean, the first time I ever saw it, I couldn't believe it. And yet, you would never hear this in the Parliament of, say, France or Spain or Italy or any country like that. Here it is. Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding. Remember, these are the Lord's. We, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the king, the public wealth, peace, and tranquility of the realm, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. Now,
Amen.
you could
That
not say
sounds like
that.
medieval.
Well, it is, and this is what I mean. They can hold on to this stuff. Now, in Catholic countries, we had to get rid of it all because the Catholic mind is about absolutes. It brooks no compromise. The Protestant mind is all compromise. So they can do this stuff and empty it of meaning. Obviously, what we need is reuniting the form and the substance.
I
That's
think we
what's
need a
needed.
new. I mean, I think we need a new Charlemagne. That's what we need to recreate Europe for the next 1,000 years of monarchies.
I can't do any specifications. God doesn't share his plans with me. But what I can say is that in England, especially if the numbers continue to grow, there is a unique, if England is converted once more to the faith, and there have been other prophecies, the prophecy of St. Edward the Confessor, that the green branch of England would one day be cut from the mother tree, wither, but then be reunited. All sorts of things like that. There'll be monks again at Glastonbury, and on and on and on. The point is that in England, and I suppose in Scandinavia and the other places like that, where they've retained so much of this stuff, let one of them become Catholic. Let one of them reinfuse those dead bones with the life-giving truth of the faith. And then you'll have something. But the problem is, for most of us Catholics, especially the diaspora, we've lived in anti-Catholic countries so long we don't remember. We don't know. We just, and when we hear it, we go, "Oh my gosh, what about Henry VIII?" Yeah, what about it? What about what you live under now? Henry VIII had to pretend to go by the law. You know, he couldn't simply alter the laws of marriage and declare, "Well, I can marry anybody I want." He had to pretend. But our masters can and do alter the laws of marriage to marry whatever they choose. They can redefine the meaning of human being. Henry VIII couldn't do that.
They can say a man and a man is a marriage, and
Sure.
or a woman and a woman. And like for that, I always say, why stop at two then? You know, the whole idea of two marriage, yes, it comes from Christ in Matthew 19 and St. Paul in Ephesians 5. And of course, it goes back. Of course, they're only drawing on Genesis 2 and 3. But why two? Why? That's what I ask all these people. What's a definition of marriage? Oh, two people who love each other. I'm like, why two? Why stop there?
Yep. Absolutely.
It not only goes against faith, not only does it go against science, but it goes against basic common sense. You know, when a man says they're a woman or something like that. And yeah, no, the philosophy that science is built on is faith-based. I know a lot of scientists are atheists today, but it's on faith presuppositions. That's why it happened in Europe. It didn't happen in China or somewhere else. And so and so eventually it's going to come back to bite them, and it already has. Like now these atheists, back in 2006, all those new atheist books are coming out. They're all fighting with each other now. I think Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists in the world, was stripped of a humanist award because he said that biological men are men or women, something like that, right?
Well,
And it's all catching up with them.
and yeah, I remember some of those new atheists used to be against the idea of free will. Well, okay,
Yeah.
but then there's no argument. There's nothing to be said.
Yeah.
You and I having a debate basically is like two animals showing different colors at each other. It's nothing.
It's molecules in motion.
Yeah, so why bother? Just go get a drink and a pistol, and
So Charles, I want to thank you for coming on. You did promise me an hour and a half. I just got one final question. Can
All
you
right.
tell us about the book you're working on now? I've heard a bit about it from our mutual friend, but if you're willing to share, if your publisher's okay with you sharing.
Well, I don't know. I haven't discussed it with him, but basically, and it's taken me long enough. I'll tell you, I should have I should have finished it 4 years ago. So this year I really got to get it out. But what it is a compilation of the writings of Otto von Habsburg on the United States.
Oh, really?
I'm the introductory chapters. The first one will be about Habsburgs in America. They put out $25 million on the church in America from 1826 to 1914, and that's 19th century dollars. Not the confetti we spend today. They founded 400 parishes in the U.S. They financed 300 missionaries, including Sir John Neumann, I should say, Sir John Neumann, Venerable Bishop Baraga, the servant of God, Father de Smet. People, you read about their exploits, and that's nice, but where do you think the money came from? It didn't grow on trees, believe me. A chunk of it came from the House of Habsburg. And that is the introductory chapter. The second is Otto himself and his adventures in the United States and his relationship with America. And then from that, we go into we'll go into his actual observations, and that's my plan anyway. I really have to get underway with it and put it out this year. So,
wow. So I guess if anyone has questions, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to say if anyone ever has any Habsburg questions, they should come to you. You seem to be the king of the Habsburg history.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but it's certainly it's an important history because just as, regardless of themselves, the current royal family in Britain and Canada, etc., are the quintessence of their countries, plural. So too with the House of Habsburg, but on a larger scale, because, of course, Habsburgs have ruled all of Central Europe and Spain, most of the Americas. The first permanent European settlement in the United States was done by the Habsburgs in 1567. St. Augustine, Florida. They, if you take them together with,
by the way.
What's that?
I was saying I love that name, by the way.
Yeah, me too. It was my confirmation saint. So
Amen.
But yeah, well, I liked him. What can I tell you? I read the Confessions and City of God when I was in high school, and I was hooked. But the truth of the matter of it is that they and the House of Bourbon, between them, are the entirety, almost, of Catholic history. And as you look at them through history, regardless of their personal strengths or failings, more or less they all attempted to reach a certain goal, a certain important spot, which was quite simply the accomplishment of the Catholic state, of the Catholic Empire, the Reichsidee. And although we're as far from that idea as we could possibly be today, if you don't have high goals, you'll never achieve anything. My father used to say, if you shoot for the stars, you may hit the horizon. If you shoot for the horizon, you'll hit the mud. And I definitely believe that.
I've got one more very quick question, and perhaps you can add 30 seconds here. Did you ever get a chance to meet Charlie Kirk when he was alive?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I never did. We had a number of friends in common, several of whom have told me since that they had wanted to get us together, but it never happened. So I didn't meet him, and I wasn't actually very aware of him, to be honest.
Oh,
I mean, I knew he was a evangelical pro-Trump fellow, but he really wasn't too much on my screen. And then as soon as he died, it turned out we knew people in common. I had all sorts of college kids I'm in touch with tell me what tremendous work he'd done for them and all that. So, but you know, I've learned in almost 65 years a terrible truth. You can't know everything, and you can't know everybody. I will say though,
try.
you yeah, you can. Hence my white hair. No, I also since we're on that point though, I'd solicit the prayers for the repose of the soul of a man named Gary Potter, who was a great influence on me. Just died at the age of 89. Gary was one of the original editors of Triumph magazine. He was just an amazing Catholic writer. He had an integral view of Catholic politics. He was the one who came up with and he may not have been original to him. I first read it in his work, that what we call conservatism in America is simply the right wing of our national liberalism.
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. Yeah,
it is, but he was the first one I ever read it from, and it was, when I read it, enormously liberating.
I'm curious, is his name spelt with one or two R's?
One R. Garypotter. The best way to find him, just put in Gary Potter Triumph, Triumph, and that will acquaint you with the magazine he wrote for and edited. It's interesting that Wayback Machine put up all the issues of Triumph and then took them down.
Interesting.
There's some thoughts you're not supposed to have.
I'm sure they're somewhere on the corners of the internet, but who knows?
If
really,
you can find them,
all right.
If you can find them, let me know.
Okay. All right. Well, Charles, thank you for coming on.
Sure.
And yeah, maybe some other time in the future I don't know what next. We've done the continent, we've done the Isles. I don't know, is the 7 Years War next? I don't know.
We can figure that out. War. We could do the Quiet Revolution.
Oh, that
the
would
Revolution
be
Tranquille that turned my people from the most noble denizens of North America to Yankees who speak French. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because having lived in California most of my life, I can't judge.
Well, wasn't the guy who the officer at the first outbreak of the Civil War a French American, P.G.T. Beauregard?
Well, he certainly was. He was a Creole from Louisiana, from New Orleans. Yeah, he sure was. Beauregard, and a great general. And after the war, a great apostle of racial reconciliation, for all the good it does him today.
Yeah, he's probably remembered as the guy who who fired on Fort Sumter, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, as my late father used to say, when you're stupid, bad things happen. And the masters of historiography in our time are uniformly stupid.
yeah, no, that's true. My mom had a history prof in university said uh, who said the art of history no longer exists. It's only journalism.
I do have to agree, sadly, but
Mm.
we try.
Amen. I know there's still some of you warriors out there. All right, I'm going to kill the stream. God bless you, Charles. Thanks for coming on. Christ is King, and hope you're doing well there in the former land of the Habsburgs.
It's great to be back. God bless
All
you and
right.
take care.
Bye.